time together. They will for you soon enough too. Yeah. Why you stuck somewhere and got stuck in a, what's that song? Stuck up here and got Dixie on mine. You ever heard Hank Williams song? You just made me, I think crazy things. When you said that, I heard I'm stuck in A&P 1 and I got biochemistry on my mind. Oh well. Well, we got to do it. That's not going to change the whole time you're here. You're just going to keep rolling through the courses, and you're going to do just fine. I get it. But we got to cover skeletal tissue today. He's already getting on me about my digressions, you know. But it's a balance. Sometimes it's unbalanced. Sometimes it's. Where's the guy that sits right there? I had something for him this morning. It's gone. The guy asked me a question yesterday about albinos. He's not here today? I'm not calling it out because he's not here. I spent my time reading, so I'm I didn't read. I also did, I had a laughing moment about, y'all, remember the first day we were talking about Shiv versus Shank? It came back up yesterday. Because I was reading, I said, oh, they caught the 5th one of the New Orleans guys that escaped from prison. And I was reading and it said they arrested some guy named last name Williams that was a maintenance worker who helped him escape, apparently. And I saved it on my phone. I didn't bring it in here because I didn't figure y'all need that. But it said, one of the inmates told me that if I did not help him escape, that he would shank me. And I thought, well, wait a minute, we already cleared that up. So I Googled that too and was reading through it. And then I stopped because I thought this, and then we're going to start because you don't want to digress. And then I thought, well, I really don't want to be taking my grammar usage for people in prison. But there's smart people in prison too. Anyway, now I know the whole background of where the terms come from, why they I'm not going to go into that, but I get a little sidetracked down rabbit holes sometimes. Y'all would be advised not to do that during PA school. When you're reading, especially in psychology, and you're reading through stuff and you're just memorizing, oh yeah, this disorder has this, and then you go, that's pretty cool, and you start getting off into like, what actually, you know, what is that type of schizophrenia? Stop. You're not out yet. You can do that later. You don't need to know that. Okay. Skeletal tissue, cartilage and bone. So what we want to look at, remember these are connective tissues. Right, I'm glad you're here. It's no fun when you walk in, the last person, and people start talking to you, I know, but I got something for you. It's like, you asked about albinos, and we were right. I mean, I could just say, we were exactly right that albinos, people with albinism have a higher incidence of skin cancer. They do, but where they studied it, everything I read, if you Google it, everything you read comes from out of some dermatology institute in Tanzania. Is that how you say it? Tanzania, and they actually studied, because in that area that's close to the equator, they get more UV light. But Africans in general in that area, they said, do not get high rates of skin cancer compared to like us here in the U.S. And specifically, they targeted and looked at albinos in that area. And they had like 1,000-fold increase in skin cancers in that area. And they're more likely to get them like in their 20s versus most in the U.S. we're 40s, 50s, 60s before we start getting them. So, leads to two things. Now we're down that rabbit hole, but leads to two things. One is you look at, well, if they're not getting skin cancer, you know, why are we all using sunscreen? You know, the whole argument's in the news right now. I'm not taking sides on that either way. Because as soon as I do, they'll just change it on me. Go, no, we were wrong. And I don't remember the second point. Functions of cartilage. When you look at the functions of cartilage, it's going to help hold bones together, but it's in areas where we don't need bone-to-bone connections. We need some flexibility. Bone itself is not completely rigid. So all connective tissues have a different consistency. We said due to the extracellular matrix and how it's made up. Ground substance, cartilage, that kind of stuff. Bone is harder than other connective tissues. But cartilage is what's going to help hold them together, and it's also going to provide like a smooth surface in joints. If you look at the knee joint, we need to not have a lot of friction. It needs to be smooth. So we're going to see cartilage covers a lot of, or connects a lot of different areas, but also covers like the ends of long bones, helps us out. And one of the big parts that we're going to talk about during this lecture is how bone and cartilage are formed. How do we make them? Right? Because when you're younger, a little kid, I watch them nowadays. The older I get, the more I watch like a little kid runs and tumbles and falls down in the street and rolls around and gets back up and keeps running. And I'm like, man, I wouldn't have got up. I'd still be down there. But they have a lot more cartilage in their bones, and like break is easy because of that. But that's why they can take a little more damage, a little more flexible than us. So definition of cartilage is dense network of collagen fibers, elastic fibers, embedded in jelly-like substance. And this is one of the few that you'll want to pay attention to from now on later, is it's the ground substance of cartilage is chondroitin sulfate. That comes back up. I don't always mention, as we go through these, what the ground substance is versus the characteristics of the tissue, but some of them are more important than others, so that one's an important one. And so it allows cartilage to endure more stress. And if you look at loose and dense connective tissues, cartilage, you could typically say, a little stronger. Right? In other words, cartilage has more collagen fibers, but cartilage also has no blood supply anymore since it developed. Now it doesn't have a blood supply, a true, dedicated blood supply that's going to help it repair very easily. Depends on the area. Start looking at ligaments, certainly. Ligaments, tendons, harder to heal than other areas of the body. Right. So if you look at the cell lineage, if you have a mature cartilage, there's chondrocytes, which came from chondroblast. And chondroblast came from mesenchyme. Because all connective tissues are derived from mesenchyme, or arise from mesenchyme, or developed from mesenchyme. I try to use all the words interchangeably, so you hear that ways of saying it. And if you look at chondrocytes, and even osteocytes, they reside in little lakes. I'll show you the picture. Little areas within it that are surrounded like a lake of interstitial fluid, and it's called a lacunae. I'll show you on the pictures. So 3 different types. If you look at cartilage itself, right, and you look at bones, you have this dense, irregular connective tissue as the bone develops called perichondrium. The perichondrium, when we get into bone, will become the very osteum that covers the bone. Like I said, it has little to no blood supply, so anything that doesn't have a great blood supply is not going to heal well. Right? So here are our types we got to discuss: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. So hyaline cartilage is everywhere. Right? Hyaline cartilage, and it says, yeah, the most abundant type. But if you look at where it's at, it covers the ends of your long bones. It's also part of your trachea, your ribs, your nose. Okay? All of that is a type of hyaline cartilage. Specifically, we want to look at more where it covers the ends of long bones, because if you were to look at tibia, fibula, femurs, the knee is the best example. Forget the meniscus, but at the ends of these long bones, and if you look at the femoral condyles, they're going to be very smooth. Well, maybe not in a lot of y'all. Right? Military is a little exception. We get a lot of knee stuff, right? I'll show you some great knees when we get to the lab and musculoskeletal. But this area is going to be covered with a hyaline cartilage. And it's going to allow a smooth kind of sliding cut. Broken in. ACL, PCL, metal one's not working here well. It's got a little bit of flexion contraction there. Anyway, I break a lot of these myself. And I blame it on y'all when they go, hey, the skeleton's in bad shape, like the students. If you're going to see me doing musculoskeletal break quite a few on accident. Anyway, it's smooth. See? Alright, fibrocartilage. I want you to keep this in mind. We're going to talk about different tissues. When you look at like a sutural joint in the head that we'll discuss, the sutures eventually fuse, but between them it's a fibrous type of tissue. And so when you say fibrocartilage or fibrous tissue, those are two different things. Like people hear those two and then they link them together. So as we go through it, I'll point that out. That this joint is connected by a fibrous tissue versus it has a fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage is a very tough type of cartilage that typically occurs as a dish-shaped segment between bones. We're reading the definition because if you look at like a meniscus in a knee, that's a type of fibrocartilage. Or if you look at an intervertebral disc in your back, that's a type of fibrocartilage, right? So we'll see that as we go through. I'll point it out again when we get to fibrous tissue. And then elastic cartilage, anywhere you need more elasticity but a little more strength. A lot of times we find this in the epiglottis. When we look at the ear, the epiglottis is flap. Y'all heard the epiglottis, I would assume. Took it as it. That's where you'll find elastic. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on elastic cartilage. That's the beginning of cartilage. Then we start to look at bone. We're going to spend more time on bone than we did cartilage. I'm down in water this morning. I don't know what it is. Everybody always thinks I'm drinking Dr. Pepper all day. It's really just water. You can't put Dr. Pepper in your water bottle because then it gets all nasty. If I'm drinking Dr. Pepper, I'll bring it in. Every class comes through and thinks I drink 100 Dr. Peppers a day. And I drink more Dr. Pepper than they do. I'm sure. It's good for you. Okay, functions of bone. That's an opinion, not a medical fact on the public. Supportive soft tissues. Hey, muscle, your muscles attached to your bones, is supporting soft tissue. Your ribs are protecting like your internal organs, your spleen, your lungs. Bones are going to help you to move around. All of that we understand probably, but we don't really always think of bone as mineral homeostasis. Right? Bone is the major reservoir, or the main place that we store calcium and phosphorus. Right? So every time you think of body levels, systemic levels of calcium, think phosphorus with it. They're linked together here because bone stores calcium and phosphorus in great numbers. And if we get a little ahead of it, we could say, systemically, if we took a lab and we looked and your calcium was low, right, where's your body going to get that from? Either you're taking it or it's going to start to take it out of your bone, osteoporosis, right? So if you're low in calcium, so the bone is storing it, but the blood system will take what it needs. We are going to talk more about that because it can lead to disorders, but also being low or high in calcium is not a good idea. We'll see it as we go through. So calcium and phosphorus. When you look at red blood cell production, let's say red bone marrow, yellow bone marrow. Right? You look down in the femur, different areas, you have yellow bone marrow, which is associated with adipose tissues. And then red bone marrow is where you see our red blood cell formation. So that happens within bone. I tried to put everything about a long bone here on one slide just to kind of simplify it. Start using new names if you're not used to these. The shaft of the long bone is actually called the diaphysis. And then you have the metaphyses on each end. So that's going to be a characteristic of all long bones. When you look at the metaphyses, that's just where, right, the diaphysis and the epiphysis meet. So we don't always annotate that one. And then the epiphyseal plate that we see here are lines in adults. Is where growing bones. So if you've heard of have kids and you talk about growth plates, that's the epiphyseal plate. So that bone for periods of time in an individual's life can actually get longer because of the plate there. It's not fused completely in the epiphyseal plate yet. Articular cartilage would be the cartilage that's covering the end of the long bone. So we're going to see that the perichondrium turned into the periosteum that surrounds this bone. But on the ends of this long bone, you're going to have articular cartilage, and you can pretty much link that with hyaline cartilage because it's the most abundant, and hyaline cartilage always covers the end of the long bones. Here it's just calling it articular cartilage, but it is a type of hyaline cartilage. The periosteum just lines the rest of the shaft of that bone. And then the medullary cavity is going to be here in the center, where we're going to have our bone marrow. And then lining the inside of that long bone, you have a periosteum out here, and on the inside you're going to have an endosteum. And then you would have your marrow. So, if we look at histology for bone, what it's made up of, the body is made up mostly of water. Bone's a denser type of connective tissue, so it has less water. It has 25% and collagen 25%, and the other 50% of that makeup is calcium, phosphorus, calcium. But if we look at the difference between a collagen type makeup and calcium, right, that's where it gets its hardness from, or compression strength. It makes the bone stronger than other tissues. Cell lineage. So we're going to throw in a new one here. Bone has an extra cell in it. Every cell lineage is different. As you go through here, micro, different classes, when people start talking about cell lineage, it's good to go, okay, well this came first, this came next, right? Histology of bone starts at mesenchyme, just like every other cell. And mesenchyme would be first. So that's a common given. I mention it every time we see a cell lineage to remind you of that. But in bone cell lineage, we have osteogenic cells. So you have mesenchyme, then you have osteogenic cells that can differentiate into osteoblasts. Okay? Osteoblasts become eventually osteocytes. So these osteogenic cells are actually stem cells, and then osteoblasts are the cells that are going to start secreting bone matrix. They're continually doing that because we remodel bone over time. So they secrete the matrix, and some of them will turn into osteocytes, which are mature bone cells, and they'll maintain the matrix, or the composition of it. At some point, we're going to need to break that down, because we're not, the bone that you have now is not the bone that you're going to have years from now. You're going to remodel it. Think of bone as like wearing out. Right? Your femur just doesn't. If you looked at somebody now and 20 years from now, the cells that are in your femur are not going to be the exact same cell. You're going to remodel that, strengthen it over time, or weaken it over time. They get replaced. So osteoclasts have to be there, which are a type of macrophage that digest bone. So osteoclast will break bone down, osteoblast will build it back up. Going on at the same time. I drew a line there because just like in this picture we have a line, and I know we discussed this last episode. When you look at bone cell lineage, we have our mesenchyme, and then we have our osteogenic cell, which will become an osteoblast, which will ultimately become an osteocyte. The osteoclast, though, is from white blood cell lineage. It's part of your immune system. So we would separate that one out when we talk cell lineage. Two different types of bone. Compact bone, spongy bone. When you look at a long bone, actually most bones have both. It's just how much of one do they have. If you look at a long bone like the femur, it has compact bone pretty much throughout the shaft of it, and then the epiphyses or the ends have a lot more spongy bone with some compact bones surrounding it. Spongy bone sometimes gets a couple of different names to keep us confused. Cancellous bone, trabecular bone, spongy bone. So we're going to look at compact bone first and how it's made up. Probably something you never studied originally in anatomy is you were to really get down to the units of what makes up a bone, they're called osteons. Or they have another name, Habasarian systems. And the way they're formed is you have rings of calcified bone matrix, and you'll form an osteon. So this would be an osteon, or what's called a Habasarian system. Now there'd be another osteon here. And this bone's been cut, but here's another osteon. Here's another osteon. In between, as these develop and are broke down and remade, these osteons, you're going to have bone fragments that are left over. So in between on this area here, I'll just kind of make a triangle. You'll see a lot of these areas. Anywhere that's not an osteon or concentric lamellae there are going to be called interstitial lamellae. They're just fragments of the older osteons as they broke down. On the outside of the bone, now we need the whole bone here to kind of reference this, but just for reference, I'll show you this is the marrow cavity. And so if we continued this around, and we're doing like a transection of a bone, we only see 1/4 of the bone here. Is going completely around the outer circumference of that bone is going to be the outer circumferential lamellae. And then on the portion of the marrow cavity, if we went around it, that would be the inner circumferential lamellae. Does my drawing kind of make sense? It's another way to think of it is you would have an outer circumferential lamellae. Now if we took and cut this in transection and we looked at it, we would have an outer circumferential lamellae around here, and just lying outside of that would be the periosteum. But if you went inside, remember we said there's an endosteum? Just before you get to the endosteum, and right before you get to the marrow cavity, there's a ring of bone that surrounds it called the inner circumferential lamellae. Go ahead. No, yeah.
So there's one outer circumferential lamellae and there's multiple inner circumferential lamellae?
No, there's multiple of each, it's just they represent it that way. It's, picture it more, and I didn't mean to, we're getting a little, now we're getting, if you took a long bone and cross-sectioned it, like I said, you would call that the outer circumferential lamellae, and then you would have the marrow cavity, and it has a ring of lamellae around it, inner circumferential lamellae. The only reason I'm noting that is it could be multiple layers of cells, bone cells, but then inside of that, you're going to have all these osteons. That's how it's going to develop. And then wherever you don't have an osteon, these areas like in here would be called interstitial lamellae. They're just leftover pieces. Good? Yeah.
For the endo-osteomedullary cavity and the inner circumferential lamellae, which one is directly going into the medullary cavity first? Like which is the touch?
Say that again.
The medullary cavity, which one is like, which layer is directly kind of like?
The inner, like if you were to, so that would be the inner, and so this would be our marrow cavity. So just inside of the inner here would be our endosteum. Sorry, I was slow morning for me. I'm trying to track. Nobody's ever asked me a question about these slides. That's what threw me off. They just take our word for it. So I'm glad y'all asked. It gave us a nice slowdown there. I can't digress because he's on me. I'm just messing with you.
In your forensic shows, would you use like an epiphyseal plate to determine age
Yes.
and like time of death and stuff?
Oh, yeah. That's the cool thing if you find a skeleton laying in grass somewhere. I never have, but I find lots of deer skeletons. You look and you look at the differences. We're going to actually study the differences between like the male and female pelvis. And just by looking at the pelvic bones, you can tell whether it's male or female a lot of times. Not always. You can also use things like, he asked me about crime shows. Do you use, like if they had a epiphyseal plate, now we know they're not an adult, because their epiphyseal plate should be closed. and you could actually age them based on that. You can also use the sutural joints in the skull. And as you get older, like at my age, my sutural joints are probably closed. So we see them here, and in children, we know that we have soft spots. And this is fibrous tissue between the sutural joints. Well, as they age, or as we age, those will fuse. So you no longer have a fibrous joint there, the bone will be fused. But even further, remember, bone's remodeling. So the older you are, the less you're going to see these. Eventually, they'll just be gone, kind of. You don't see this as well. And you have to go look at some skeleton remains in their skulls and see that they don't have as prominent lines. There's a lot of things that can tell you how old they are. What they ate, do they smoke? No. Love crime shows up. I started watching some show last night. I'm going to see how it is for you. Called American Rust. I think it's an older show, but I just started watching. Nobody's watched it. Okay, that's good. It's alright. It's a little weird because it has the guy that played like in Dumber and Dumber as a serious character. Yes, except a child would have an epiphyseal plate. You, as an adult, would have an epiphyseal line. And that goes with the same thing with fractures. You fracture a bone, and so I should have answered that differently for you. An epiphyseal line just means you have an epiphyseal plate that has closed. Now you can see the line. And if you fracture your arm, you also can see the line. Right? You know, you see children, you're going to learn like in emergency medicine how to look for signs of like kids that did they break their arm or did somebody else break it and they never brought them in? And sometimes you'll learn about it. It's unfortunate. Hopefully it doesn't bother anybody, but they have kids that got foster. I had a foster kid who had a hip problem. And so I took them in, and they had like, I don't remember the number, 13 or 20 undiagnosed fractures. Just randomly, they x-rayed. I'm like, holy crap. But the reason I brought that up is not for the negative side of it, is the lines are still there. You can still see them. You can still see a epiphyseal line. Probably shouldn't have gone there. I didn't mean to upset it. I quit fostering for a while, so had a rough go the last one. It's tough. Tough. Anyway, the kids aren't the toughest. You know what's tough? Department of Family Services, CPS. My goodness. Anybody foster? They're terrible. We've had a lot of students. We had students that were fostering while they went to PA school. I'm like, that's crazy. That's crazy. It takes a lot of time where it's hard to be a foster parent because of the government. They never liked us. You got me on the digression, both of you. But you should foster. Why? Or do something. Once you're making all that big PA money, right, you're going to be out there, you're enjoying life. You can get to a point in life where you go, I feel like I need to give something back, or I need to do this. Fostering is a great way to do that. And it teaches you a whole, especially if you have young kids, like my kids saw a whole different life than theirs by going through it. They'll tell you that. One of them wrote an essay on it that got him into A&M thing. Telling the other one, you need to write the same essay. Okay. Histology of bone tissue continued. Lacunae, I said they'll show you the lakes. If you look really close at the osteon, that you have a blow up over here. And so this is an osteocyte, and it resides, just like chondrocytes do, we just didn't visualize them, in this lake. So all of this surrounding it's interstitial fluid, and each one of the lacunae are connected by little channels called caniculi. Those serve a big purpose because if the osteocyte is maintaining the bone, it not only needs nutrients and things, how's it going to get it? Or if it needs nutrients, how's it going to get it? It's got to have extracellular fluid surrounding it, so the caniculi allow interstitial fluid to flow through that bone. Kind of interesting. But we're also going to need blood supply. And so when you look at the center of an osteon, what's going to develop there is blood and lymphatic vessels that go through. So remember, this is an osteon too. And so the vessels that go vertical are the central canal. And then you're going to have a way to get the blood to that central canal, and that's called a perforating, or Volkmann got his name on it. So Volkmann's canals, but they're perforating canals because there's an extensive blood supply to bone outside. And the perforating canals are going to allow it to go into the cortex of the bone so it can go up and down, along with lymphatics. So that's what compact bone looks like. And now we look at spongy bone. Spongy bone doesn't use osteons. Instead, they still have lamellae. They still have technically lamellae, but they're called trabeculae because they're in like columns like we see here. Okay, if you take all those and mix them together, we'll see what spongy bone looks like. Spongy bones is where most of the hematopoiesis takes place. Right? So you're going to make blood cells in spongy bone. Or you can take EPO if you're Lance Armstrong, but either way, you need red blood cells. I can't confirm he actually did that. I mean, he did give up all his titles. So. He'd probably still outride me with 2 broken legs. But anyway. Armstrong's dropping out of people's minds. There's people in here who don't know who Lance Armstrong is, right? Yeah. He's disappearing into history. He lost it. You know who he is?
Landed on the moon, right?
What's that?
Landed on the moon, right?
Yeah. Hey, landed on the moon. That's all you need to know. Histology of bone tissue. So, I had all sorts of digressions I could have gone off on. It culminated in MSU or SMU, but I'm not going there. Within each trabecula of spongy bone are lacunae, just like we saw in compact bone. And so you'll see them residing kind of in there. So really, if we just want to give a good picture of spongy bone versus compact, this is compact bone. Okay, that's your medullary cavity. Oops, black on black didn't work. And then in the ends of long bone, you typically see this kind of crosshatched work, almost like we looked at reticular. Right? These are trabeculae that are crossing over each other to make it look like spongy. Right? So I have some over in the lab. I don't know what happened to one in here, but if you have a cross section of bone, you'll see it looks just like that. It's spongy bone and compact bone. If you look at why we would use it, it is for red blood cell production. But spongy bone also is going to weigh less than compact bone. So this is the fun part. How do we form bone? How do we go through ossification? How do we make bone and make new bone? Osteogenesis. I like that word better than ossification. With ossification, I start thinking about all sorts of things. But osteogenesis, bone beginning, bone formation. How you get new bone. So of course we can do this in the womb as an embryo. We start to form bones. Those bones will continue to grow until we get into adulthood. Unless you have a disorder as an adult, you're generally not growing anymore bone-wise. And then remodeling a bone, which occurs throughout your whole life. And then repair of fractures. If you break that bone, we got to repair it. We got to look at all 4 of these. And when I said here's the fun part, is learning the difference between what they call intermembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. They're really not that hard, but when you're looking at how we make up spongy bone, typically uses intermembranous. But you can use endochondral to make compact and spongy. So don't get tied up so much in that of which one does what. Just learn the processes here, because we're going to see differences. Because really, when you look at endochondral ossification, it's unique in that you're going to form a cartilage model first. We're going to make a model of that bone and then, with chondrocytes. Then we're going to turn it into compact bone. So this is the simple way to do it. Use intermembranous ossification. And if you look at the skull, the mandible, the clavicle, these are formed that way. The skull is where we're going to focus most. So you take these mesenchymal cells that are in that area of the skull, they start to develop inside of a membrane. And so they're not going through a cartilage model. They just start to develop in that membrane. You're going to have multiple areas that do this, that are called ossification centers. So here's your, we're talking skull, flat bones, right, like we see on the skeleton. And so each area, you're going to start to see the development of these osteoblasts, and they're making this ossification center. I'm going to learn one. I just keep doing the same thing over and over with that screen. And then they'll start to calcify. So you'll have other minerals, salts, calcium, that go into the extracellular matrix, and that area will start to harden. And then it will start to form trabeculae. The trabeculae as they form will start to fuse together and create that kind of cross-hatched look. And then ultimately, you'll see you'll have spongy bone. If we look at a skull, you'll have the spongy bone that's in the center, and the outer portions of that out here will become compact bone. Right? And you'll, of course, have a periosteum that lines it. So if we look at a skull, it's a flat bone, but it has both. This is where I generally break this thing. And this one's not an example at all, but when you generally pull up a skeleton or one that's done better, this one's not real, you would say there's compact bone here and here, like in the picture, a little flat area at the bottom, there's compact bone on each side, but in between that, and you can see a few, they're representing it somewhat, there's the spongy bone between them. So you know it's a flat bone. So the flat bone is going to develop all these ossification centers, and eventually they will form the flat bone out of it, and then they will have sutures between them. So that's flat bone or ossification. Go ahead, Wyatt.
Does the skull have periosteum on the interior and the exterior?
Yes. The periosteum lines it. And then we have our tissues that are lost my train of thought. Yes, it's fine. What's the tissue that's our meninges? Losing my mind. I hate it when I have a lapse. I can't remember something. Even though it wasn't important at the moment. Alright, so that's spongy bone. Endochondral ossification, the biggest difference is we are going to take and make a cartilage model of what we want, like a femur, to look like. And then we're going to replace the cartilage with bone. And in this case, we're not going to have all these little ossification centers. We're going to have one primary and two secondary ossification areas for growth. So I gave a bunch of slides to this. So the first thing we're going to see is cartilage is going to develop in that embryo and form. Let's just keep picturing the femur. So this is going to develop into a femur. And the cartilage will look like we would expect that femur to start to look. You'll take mesenchymal cells, they'll develop into chondroblast, and then they'll form this cartilage model. As you go further along, the chondrocytes will continue to divide, and this bone will actually get wider and lengthen. It's going to get to look like it should for a bone. And as it's doing that, in the center, the primary ossification center, in the diaphysis, that cartilage will start to be replaced by bone. The calcium will be deposited in there and it will start to ossify. Now the picture depicts it as already open, right? It already looks like it has a medullary cavity, but it hasn't. I didn't have another picture there. So all of this area that was cartilage in the middle will turn into, will ossify, become bone instead of cartilage. And then osteoclast, as we'll see in another slide, will come in there and digest the marrow cavity. I just wanted to make that point. I could have just switched to the next slide, I guess. Oh, got ahead of myself. So the way we're going to develop the medullary cavity is for those osteoclasts to come in here and break down this whole area. That'll give us our medullary cavity. On the ends, the epiphyses, or the ends of long bones, on each end of a femur, you're going to have secondary ossification centers that are going to do the exact same thing. The cartilage that's in that area will start to ossify and become bone. So that's a secondary ossification center, which we have two. And then we will leave articular cartilage. So all of this area of the end of the long bone will go through ossification, but part of it won't. The end of the long bone will remain cartilage. And that will be what type of cartilage? It says it on the slide. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage covers the ends of all long bones. That will remain. What will also remain, because remember we're forming these in an embryo and then into a child, they're not adults yet, you will have the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is also hyaline cartilage until it fuses. And that's what we see. This answers his question from earlier where I got kind of off into broken bone stuff. But about 18, 21 years old, about the age that a lot of people joining the military are going to, the growth plates will be completely closed. Which is amazing because before I started getting into this, I would have thought they closed a lot sooner than that. I mean, I know you got middle school kids and stuff playing sports, you got to worry about growth plates, but 18, I guess, I thought people like 18. Growth plates, if you don't know, can be a big problem because if you child breaks a bone and the break goes through the growth plate, it can stop the growth of that bone or cause deformities associated with that. So that's a big deal in children. So once you go through ossification of the bone, it's no longer going to get longer or get wider. That bone's as big as it's going to get. And we don't need to get into, well, wait, I know somebody who grew 3 inches taller after they turned 18. Okay, there's no real normal. You know what I mean, in this world. Everybody in here, there's nothing normal about us. Even though we say all the time, we're studying normal. But for most people, the bones will not get larger because their growth plates will close. Can bone get thicker, bigger, heavier, and look like it's growing? Yeah, it's called acromegaly. Andre the Giant. Bone growth disorders can affect that. But in most people, the bones aren't. So this is a 3-year-old radiograph showing the epiphyseal plate, and that will ultimately fuse and become the epiphyseal black. You got bored yet? I don't know. Bio came on your mind?
I have a question.
Yes, I'm glad, because I was trying to pause for a second. I've just been droning on and on.
I was just waiting. For the bone growth, like in my kids, when they grow, do they grow simultaneously on both sides or extremities, or like one grows first and then the other one will follow?
I'm trying to mess with you. That's a funny question. Can I mess with you a little bit? I'll say this it should happen that way. When you said that, I thought, how many kids do you see walking around like this? And they go, he'll grow out of it. Yeah, they're pretty normal. They should. If not, you're going to notice very soon. You know, you're going to walk around with one hand in your pocket, one hand in your arm. But he'll reach his other pocket soon. Sorry, I think it's a valid question, but yes, they should grow at the same time.
And sorry, the second question.
That's what you were asking, right? Is do growth plates, and does the bone grow at the growth plates at the same
time? Yeah.
rate? Yeah.
And does that like also the muscle also grow the same time as the bone?
I hope so. You're killing me. Yes, yeah. Actually, bones are muscles there, but it can lengthen. But I don't want to get too deep into that. We're not actually making new skeletal muscle cells. But also remember, tendons can enlarge too. It has to grow with it. It's actually a great question in regards to when we talked about when you're younger, your spinal cord actually stops growing at a certain age, but your vertebral column continues to grow. I'm going to leave it at that. There are areas like that where, but muscles are going to lengthen, tendons are going to lengthen. It's all. I was joking with you because they're going to. Once again, my crazy mind picture, well, if their bones are growing and muscles don't lengthen with them, they're going to just rip them off. Right?
But that's
It'd be a very painful life to have.
because I have seen like kids when they like over summer they went from chubby to like something really skinny, and that kind of questioned me of like, is that just the bone growing or is something happening?
You mean like they got taller, so they got skinnier? That's what you said, right? I don't know. Maybe they're hitting the protein powder in the gym twice a day. I don't know. That's what my kids are doing. Maybe they were chubby and they got skinny. I like that. I am joking with you, but you're getting a lot into some things associated not only with bone disorders, bone growth, not disorder, bone growth in general in children, but what you're also bringing in now is endocrine. Endocrine plays a big role in how they develop. And kids that go from, what'd you say?
HGH.
Yeah, HGH, human growth hormone. I'm making sure it was something serious, because I just kept talking serious. I didn't enjoy the joke and stuff. But you gotta bring in the endocrine system. The endocrine system is gonna trigger changes in the body that somebody would go from, all babies are kind of chubby looking, using your words. All babies are cute. That's just something we lie to people about them. And some of y'all might know. Oh, he's so cute. All of y'all's kids are beautiful, but I'm talking about other people. Okay, sorry. Let's finish this and then we'll. Almost. Hey, bone remodeling. We won't finish this. I'm going to go and then we'll break in a second. Bone remodeling is an ongoing replacement of old bone with new bone. It's happening right now in you. It's constantly being resorbed. You're going to take the minerals out of that bone, which the the calcium and phosphorus. Right? So you're going to have osteoclasts that go in and do that. They're going to break down bone, which means to bring those minerals out of the bone back into the blood system and resorb them. And then bone deposition is where the osteoblasts are going to come back and apply a new bone, make new bone. So because of that, over time, bones will remodel. Not only that, they will remodel based upon the stress that you put upon them. I think looking at older individuals, like the elderly, is a better way of talking about bone remodeling than kids. You could say, yeah, as a kid develops, I could make an argument for not playing the same sport all year long because of bone growth remodeling. It's better to play multiple sports in my opinion. But nowadays when you do your gender reveal and you're an infant, you got to write down they play first base. Well, that's a joke. Y'all know what I mean. These fancy numbers. Come up to me while I'm coaching T-ball and say, he's third baseman. He don't play every position with me, so you're not gonna you may want to get a different team. Let's take a break because I got work.
I get my wife back into it. We just watched
So last. It seems like, yeah, like, after
Yeah. No, they were trying to, you gotta remember, they were a lot smaller than the you know, it's pretty much dots. So it really wouldn't matter because the model was developed as a curve. They're not,
So it's always been five to three, except the only thing that is the like that. No, so even with the touch, it's when DNA yeah, so DNA polymers, which is basically that's an enemy that reading it, synthesizing it, and even all five of them. So being yeah, even but so the main thing is to make street bias synthesizing, reading it, even more.
it's like stretching. And there are pain fibers. Curiosity is bone. Pain fibers and those fibers are like, so if the bone's trying to grow, we also have that. Suncone's not near as common as the concept. There's not really enough light to blow under the sympathy to get the place to the red bone right there. There's also certain light.
That's the heavy duty.
Build harder because I use it.
crazy is I was looking at the special census slide there this year, 360. But I thought the census was only 60 slides. So I'm like, by the time I go through the information, what I thought was only like 40% of each little section. If that makes sense.
All that cuts out all the how it developed, where these neurons come from, the special senses where they're at. It's not what other pathways they travel. When you want to cut special senses, you just study it. I would just combine cranial and special senses.
That's what they do. What they do.
Because you want cranial measure it tells you what the special sense is. And then you would do something like olfactory. You study that.
Well, trainer one, the whole smell, literally in that book, just had a paragraph and a half of it. And all it was one from the nasal cavity, the olfactory ileum to the olfactory bulb, and the examiner or what else it is. And then there's a slide, it didn't go into detail about it, and just how it like ran through what the dominant yeah, we talked about that. But all it said was through Paul, it said, and it didn't go into detail. I'll be
Yeah.
Called DJ Good.
Just a care.
Oh,
But it's more just seeing that. I know everybody's gonna have to deal with it. Don't worry about life.
I mean, study like it's gonna get you, and then you'll
I don't even have, oh yeah,
I have put a little
I'm not judging. You gotta balance it with all the other parts. Oh my goodness, what time I was I'm only finishing boning.
Don't tell them what you think.
My kids eat healthy. I'm having to make different stuff for dinner. I had these leftovers from being fresh. I walked in, I was working on it, trying to like, it smells good. My daughter, she like, some type of funky looking rice with grilled salmon and all this. I'm like, I'm not into it. That's great. That's great. What we had last night, roast beef, I like roast beef. No. I like fish for dinner. Plus it's like long gone silver.
It's got a fried coating on it. Smothered hard.
My kids, I don't know where they got it from. My kids and my wife, they're all like behind me. boys tell me,
Yeah,
like,
boys,
I
like,
get the
it's
question
just
all the time,
June,
how many times
June, I start getting like.
And then I wonder, how many slides are in this thing?
I don't count them, I don't care. But what they don't see is I drink more water than that. I'm constantly like, I drink water during lecture most of the time, but I'm one of the people, every time I walk by my school, I measured it the other day for my wife. She was like, you need to get a big bottle, you know, it's not gonna be big. Every time I walk in here, every hour or so, I drink something else. I just sweat. I don't sip water.
This is close, yeah, it's like, I think it's about 8 years in there, so it's like, it's just guys, so like 2 of these and then like a little top off. Yeah, this is like, yeah. This one says 64 ounces. I just remember when I got it, it's supposed to 60 ounces. Two of those a day with a little extra. My little extra is I'd rather just know what I'm consuming.
At the end of the day, no matter what you're eating,
I still have coffee.
make the basic meal, like set, you're both
They're like, my first month back here, with a GPA, my body had like zero it's like,
so like really versatile is like when you're actually working.
getting all this other yeah. It's not well raised. You just go, you might just throw it balls out.
It's just more of you have to use my body.
That was so
Your
good.
brain games like
You got to have it.
I just don't know if
It's like use it for like 10 days. It's just we haven't got it yet. We're like go get it, cook with it, and then use it again. That's just getting back
but also I wouldn't want to go drinking. I think I would want to be practice. Because that's also one of the reasons why I didn't want to be out. I wanted to be 4 years of school, and then whatever it is that we like, 2 years of practice, and then go drink.
Your eyes will be
Out there.
Disregard.
Unless you go and get like sushi or whatever, you know, it's the same thing. The only thing I know you can do with MPI and you just don't remember. It's a specific school, so it's not like a general like you're a it's in and have like how they're more complex.
what if bone doesn't, what if you don't have the right balance between bone and breaking it down, building it back up? In other words, you develop disorders. I just listed a few: acromegaly. Right? You get these abnormally heavy and thick bones. You start to become Andre the Giant. Right? You grow a lot. With that, though it's not set on the slide and it's not really important for here, comes a lot of other problems: heart problems, calcium homeostasis problems, as we'll see tomorrow with calcium homeostasis. If you lose a lot of calcium, we know that makes your bones weak, called osteoporosis. There's also a disease called osteomalacia. Right? There's rickets, osteomalacia, and these two are forms of soft bone. Right? Don't get tied up in it yet, because in ortho you're going to discuss those a lot. But think of when you look at osteoporosis, think of bone that doesn't have enough calcium and it breaks easy. When you think of osteomalacia or rickets, think of soft bone. Immature bone that's not developed, they're rickety. They're soft. If your bones are soft, you kind of sway around, right? Jello. Ortho would love the way I just described all that. Maybe like, what the hell did you just tell them? That's a visual thing. Hey, so what happens when you remodel bone? We already said that we need to strengthen bone and replace it. You put demand on it. I don't think I finished my thought earlier when I said it's easier to view elderly when it comes to like osteoporosis and things and bone density. So what's the best thing that we should be doing in our lives, all of our life, from now till the day we die? Yeah, lifting weights, but what's something simpler? Walking against gravity, not taking the elevator over there. I was talking to a couple of y'all the other day. I said, I'm going to take these stairs until I can no longer take those stairs. But that's also a spinal cord injury PA thing. I'm not going to walk. I'm not going to take the elevator, but I can take the stairs. I don't know. Maybe if you get above 4 flights, I might take the elevator. But I'd rather take the stairs. But it's also, as you get older, that helps you maintain your bone density. And so an elderly person, one of the best things they could be doing is walking every day, whether they like to walk or not. It's no different than even in our age, your age. If you go lay in bed for 2 weeks, look at what your muscle mass is after just 2 weeks of laying out doing nothing. Yeah. You lose that really fast, all the gains. And you lose your couple of months of gains in the gym in a day or two because you're. Anyway, alteration of bones for better stress. You put more stress patterns on them. New bone, of course, is more resistant to fracture. And then we need we also need bone to be resorbed and redeposited because of the way we're balancing. It's a big part of it because we're also not just remodeling it, but we're maintaining calcium homeostasis. And when we say calcium homeostasis, what we really mean is managing the systemic calcium levels. Because bone just stores calcium. Yeah, phosphorus. I put some basic breaks in here because we're going to talk about fracture repair. So I threw a couple in here for you to know. If you have a fracture, it can be open or closed. So if you have an open fracture, though, you may have bone coming out of the skin. Got some blood dripping down. Right? It's going to bleed a lot. A comminuted fracture is, I don't know, it's just like an explosion of the bone there. It would be like something hitting you, somebody hitting you with a pipe or something across your arm. And it just explodes the bone in that area versus separating a clean break fracture or jamming that bone together. Because the impact fracture looks similar, but impact fractures generally look intact. So if you have like a foosh injury, which is a fall on an outstretched hand, and you can drive the two parts of the bone together, right? It's driving it this way, your body's driving it that way, the bone can push together and it can fracture that bone. Often picture impact fractures like, it's not necessarily true, compared to like a comminuted fracture where there's a bunch of pieces, an impact fracture, you'll have a fracture line because the bone's broken. But in my mind, I picture like the periosteum stayed intact, but it's broken in there. You know what I mean? It's not true, but that's somewhat, but not really. And then a green stick fracture is what your kids are going to get. Kids' bones are more pliable. If you take a twig off a tree outside and you break it, we know it's a green stick, right? It's green. It will not break like if you pick one up off the ground that was broken, or sorry, that was old. And it'll snap fairly easily. But a green stick fracture is just like you broke that twig and some pieces broke and some didn't. Kids' bones do that when they have like fusion injuries, falling, outstretched hand. And it'll start to look splintered. Well, then we gotta fix them. So how are we gonna fix it? We do fracture repair. The first step, within the first few hours, right, 6 to 8, whatever, you have to form a clot. This follows kind of the same thing that happens with wound healing, but we need a clot. Blood is very vascular, blood's very vascular. The bone is very vascular, it has a good blood supply. And so you're gonna need to form a clot, but here they call it a fracture hematoma. Blood clot's a hematoma too, right? This is a fracture hematoma because you have all these vessels in the periosteum and in the osteons that is leaking into this area, and so you'll start to form a hematoma over it. The second and third steps of this, you're going to start to turn that hematoma into a callus. Between a few weeks to up to as many as 6 months, and in that case, you're going to have phagocytes go in there and remove not only the debris, but you're going to have fibroblasts that come into that area and start to deposit a bunch of calcium. Now, I need to just quit. I'm not going to deposit collagen. You're going to deposit a bunch of collagen in this area. And so now you're going to have a fibrous callus. And then that osteoblast, right, are going to start to come in there and form a bony callus. Right, so you form this fibrous cartilaginous callus in here, then the osteoblast will come in there and start to change this into the bony callus. And the final step, what's going to happen is that as that bone was formed, it makes like a, remember I don't want to say that, that'll confuse you. Just the bone's going to be remodeled. As that fibrocartilaginous callus is formed and you start to form bone, it kind of looks like spongy bone and will ultimately become compact bone, and you will repair that fracture. And then the blood vessels will be restored and all. But there will still be a line there, a fracture line, where you can see it, even though it's fully repaired. If you like kids' sports, it makes me always think of, you've had a guy playing football or a girl playing football, whoever's playing football, and they break their arm, or they break some other bone. Or even in Little League, baseball, softball, they'll break their arm. And the doctors, ortho will let them back out there how soon? 6 weeks? Back out on the field? Maybe sometimes earlier, depends on the break. But when you really look at how bone heals, I've never really talked to a very, very good ortho about this. If it takes a few weeks to as many as 6 months just to form this callus, much less make the new bone, that means that fracture is still very weak, even though they had that cast on it, right? The cast held it in line long enough to be strong enough to fuse and all. And on average, I'm just talking off the top of my head. You go out into society and do normal things, that shouldn't be a problem. But you're allowing them to go straight back into playing full contact sports at 6 weeks. They know better than I do. It also depends. Are we talking like playoffs or just a season game? The playoffs, you need to get back in there. You need to brace it up. North Dallas 40.
So this is like your body's naturally doing this, or
Yeah.
you actually went to the doctor and they said this process?
Oh, I see the distinction right there. You're going to have to, if it's a displaced fracture, like an open fracture or an angulate, if you break like your humerus in the mid shaft, the surgical area of that shaft, the deltoid holds onto that, so it's going to pull the top of the femur, or top of the humerus out. And sometimes it'll open. That's going to have to be reset before this will occur. But if you didn't reset it, this would occur. You'd have a funky looking bone. You will heal. Right? You'll actually see that when you're pointing in some people, right? But yeah, you need to reset it. But a lot of fractures don't have to be reset. They're still fractured. But yeah, that's the answer to what you're asking. It's going to go on in both, but the way we do it, no, we're going to reset it first. That's the purpose of that cast, though, is to help keep that lined up. Or to pin and screw it, that kind of stuff. Alright, ortho's a fun topic. There you go, vitamins necessary. Vitamins are necessary for a lot of things in life, but in bone especially, if we looked at just in bone, vitamin A stimulates activity of osteoblasts. So there's another area vitamin A helps. Vitamin C, C for collagen. It helps with synthesis of collagen. Vitamin D, we've always heard, is associated with healthy bones, right? Because what vitamin D actually does, though, is promotes absorption. We didn't put it into somewhere. It causes, vitamin D helps you to absorb more calcium in the GI tract. That's a key part of it. You need vitamin D so that you can absorb the calcium that you need from your nutritional stuff. Vitamins K and B12, you look at some of the bone proteins, they help with that. We're not going to go deep into that. The main one we're going to talk about is calcium homeostasis and looking at in other words, what calcium homeostasis means controlling how much calcium is in the systemic system, taking it in and out of bone. So how does that happen? What we haven't learned yet, and maybe you've started it a little bit in cardiology, is calcium is not just for bone. Calcium is a very important thing regarding like synaptic clefts. Calcium is associated with the proper functioning of like voltage-gated channels that allow ion flow. So calcium is used in a lot of different areas. It's also part, you see up there, the clotting cascade or blood clotting. You need to have normal calcium levels. So we're going to see that calcium not only needs to be stored in the body and bones, but your systemic level needs to be maintained, highly regulated. So the way we're going to use this is use parathyroid hormone. Alright. So parathyroid hormone promotes resorption of bone matrix. Now, let's just draw an arrow. Because parathyroid hormone, the easiest way to think about it, increases blood. Takes forever with this mouth. Calcium levels. So everything that parathyroid hormone does, if you need to raise blood calcium levels, systemic level of calcium in the body, you're going to release parathyroid hormone. So let's look at the statements underneath that and say, okay, well, promoting resorption of bone matrix, yeah, that would increase blood calcium, right? You're going to take calcium out of the bone. Prevents loss of calcium in the urine. It's a true fact. We regulate minerals through urine output when you study renal. So basically, parathyroid hormone tells the kidneys, hey, don't let any calcium out. We need to keep it in the body. Whatever you were going to let out, don't let out. And then it also promotes vitamin D, which is another name for vitamin D is calcitriol. Right? And calcitriol is actually what it promotes the intestinal absorption of calcium. So all of those would increase blood calcium levels, but then you could draw a line here and say, well, what if your blood calcium levels are too high? Whoops. Draw a line there. Say, okay, well, calcitonin decreases. Okay, you need to write it better than I did. Decreases blood calcium levels. So in this case, we have too much calcium systemically, and you'll have some cells that are close to your thyroid gland called parafollicular cells. They will release calcitonin. Calcitonin inhibits bone resorption. If you can't, you got to think of it. Well, I have high calcium levels in the blood. So a couple of things I can do. The kidneys can continue to normally take out excess calcium and things, but you also can stop resorbing it from the bone as much as you were. So that's the difference. They sound the same. Calcitriol starts the activation so that or promotes intestinal resorption of calcium to increase the levels. Calcitonin, which sounds very similar, actually decreases blood calcium levels. More to follow in endocrine. But nobody likes endocrine, so I will leave that for Jury. Alright, joints. We're almost there to our stopping point for the day. We're going to finish early. I'm not going to digress this out of it like I did yesterday. A point of contact between two bones. This is just the introduction to what a joint is. Right, we're not getting into musculoskeletal just yet, but anywhere you have a connection of bone to cartilage, right, we're going to have a joint. So fibrous joints. Now remember earlier I said there is a difference between fibrous tissue and fibrocartilaginous tissue. Those are two different things consistency-wise. A fibrous joint has fibrous tissue. So when you look at sutures in the head, they have fibrous connective tissue that connect them together. But another way to look at fibrous tissue is saying, well, there's a syndesmosis or a gomphosis. Okay. So a syndesmosis is just a larger space than a normal fibrous joint. When you look at a gomphosis, that's where your teeth set in the sockets. It's where your teeth are in the sockets of your mandible there. Now, the actual bony part of the mandible where it goes down is called alveoli. But where the tooth sits into the soft tissue there, and the connection between bone to bone, there's soft tissue between it, that joint type is called an gomphosis. Right? If you can't see the skeleton, I'm talking about this and that. You got your tooth, you have the bony part here. This is actually, we'll see, called the alveolar process. And so the joint that lies between the tooth and the alveolar process is what's actually called a gomphosis. If you have a sutural joint, that's easy to visualize. That's the suture bones of the head. But then a good example of a syndesmosis will be where you have fibrous tissue between two bones, and we call that the interosseous membrane. So we have a tibia and a fibula there. In between them, we're going to have fibrous connective tissue that's connecting, going between them, separating the compartments of the legs. And so that fibrous tissue will be called a syndesmosis. And then difference are cartilaginous joints. In this case, it's not fibrous tissue, it's fibrocartilage. It can be hyaline cartilage there. Anything that's a fibrocartilaginous type of tissue. Right? Most cartilaginous joints do not have a synovial cavity, so they're not considered synovial joints. I'm not going to go into that just yet, but our examples are synchondrosis, where you have hyaline cartilage connecting bones, and a synchondrosis may go through ossification with age. So now we've added, what's a synchondrosis can be also known as, that we talked about earlier. Epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal plate is hyaline cartilage. We discussed that. Well, it's also a synchondrosis, and it may fuse with age. Not all of them do. And then a symphysis is another type of cartilaginous joint, and it's just fibrocartilage that connects bones. So here's your examples. Where we have an epiphyseal plate here, that's hyaline cartilage, it's a synchondrosis. They name it, they make the distinction between that because it's fibrocartilaginous and the fact that it sometimes fuses. So we see those in a lot of areas. And then the pubic symphysis would be a great example of fibrocartilaginous tissue connecting two bones. So the pubic symphysis. And then our intro to synovial joints. Anytime you hear synovial joints, think that it's going to be very mobile. The shoulder, the knee, those types of things. Things we have synovial capsules, right? Because every joint generally has an articular capsule. Articular capsules are made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, and often are surrounded by tendons like the rotator cuff tendons. That makes your capsule. But some joints have an extra layer of synoviocytes inside of the capsule. Synoviocytes are cells that release synovial fluid, like in the knee. So they call that the synovial membrane, and they release synovial fluid. It basically oils the knee. No different than shooting some Simvisc in there, right? It's oil for the knee, but synovial fluid in that case also is carrying nutrients and waste in and out of that joint, right? Because the synovial fluid doesn't just, it's not like fluid in the back of the eye that doesn't go anywhere. It gets reabsorbed and put back in there. We don't need to get into that, but it allows the lubrication and nutrients and waste to get in and out. So articular cartilage, the epiphyses of bone, are not covered by the synovial membrane. I kind of need to take that out at this point until we start talking about musculoskeletal. But if you looked at the knee, here's the easiest way to explain it. It's each one of these bones has articular cartilage, and we said specifically that it's hyaline cartilage. And then we're going to have a synovial capsule that surrounds some of the parts of the inside of the knee. Right? But the cartilage itself of these two will not be inside the membrane, is what it's saying. That's all we need to know for now. You don't even need to know that if you're plugged in the past. We'll get back to that. Sometimes you got to say things so you're not lying later. You may not know what I mean, but you got to put it there because that's where it belongs, but we're not talking about it yet. But it'll make sense. And then we ran into your definitions. As always, I didn't say that yesterday at the end of the block. There were some definitions too that I didn't cover. I started passing today. Remember, you are always responsible for my definitions. I will ask you one of those every class. That's my stopping point for today, and we'll pick up and start muscle tomorrow. Is that all right with y'all? About 10 people. I will always say this, that you do whatever you need to do to get through this program. I consider it, not everybody in this building thinks the way I do, obviously, but having come through the program,